A procession moves through the bleak, windswept plains of Castile. It travels only by night, a phantom train lit by the flickering orange of 100 torches. At its head rides a young woman, her face pale as bone, her black velvet robes blending into the darkness. She is a queen, but she wears no crown. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, are fixed on the object that follows her, a massive, lead-lined coffin, drawn by 4 black horses. Inside lies the body of her husband, dead for months. But for her, he is not gone. Each night, when the procession halts at a monastery or a desolate church, she performs a chilling ritual. She orders the heavy lid of the coffin to be pried open. The stench of death, barely masked by embalming spices and incense, fills the cold air. But she does not flinch. She leans in, her long dark hair brushing against the decaying finery of the corpse, and she kisses his cold, lifeless feet. She speaks to him, whispering words of love and jealousy, her voice a raw nerve in the sacred silence. She is Queen Juana of Castile. And this macabre pilgrimage is the horrifying climax of a story that began not with death, but with a political deal. A deal designed to build an empire, but which instead constructed a private hell for 2 young souls, a hell from which one of them would never escape. To understand how a vibrant, intelligent princess became the guardian of a rotting corpse, we must go back. We must unravel the knot of politics, passion, and poison that destroyed her. Our story begins in a palace of stern, imposing stone, the Alsquatzar of Segovia. This was the heart of a newly forged Spain, a kingdom united by the formidable marriage of its 2 rulers, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. The Catholic monarchs. They were visionaries, warriors, and ruthless political strategists. They had conquered Granada, expelling the last of the Moors from Spain. They had funded Columbus, opening up a new world of unimaginable wealth. And they had one great, overarching fear: France. The powerful, ambitious kingdom to their north was their perpetual rival, a constant threat to their expanding influence. Their entire foreign policy, their life's work, was geared towards one goal: the containment and isolation of France. And in the 15th century, the most powerful weapon in a monarch's arsenal was not an army, but a child. Marriages were the bedrock of alliances. A daughter's hand in marriage could be worth more than 1,000 cannons. Isabella and Ferdinand had a quiver full of such arrows. 5 children, each a potential key to locking France in a cage of hostile powers. Their grand strategy was a masterstroke of political chess, they called the double marriage. They would forge an unbreakable bond with another rising European power, the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by the equally ambitious Maximilian I of the House of Habsburg. The plan was simple and symmetrical. Ferdinand and Isabella's only son and heir, Juan, would marry Maximilian's daughter, Margaret of Austria. In turn, Maximilian's son and heir, Philip, would marry Ferdinand and Isabella's second daughter, Juana. This double-stranded cord of marriage would bind Spain and the empire together, creating a superpower bloc that would encircle and neutralize France. It was a brilliant plan, a perfect political calculation, and like all calculations that treat human beings as numbers, it was destined for catastrophic failure. The pawn at the center of our story was the infant Juana. At 16, she was not considered a primary political asset. She was the 3rd child, unlikely to ever inherit the throne. Her brother, Juan, was the heir. Her older sister, Isabella, was next in line. Juana was simply a spare, a bargaining chip for a secondary alliance. But she was no simple girl. She was fiercely intelligent, excelling in her studies. She was a gifted musician, fluent in Latin, and possessed a sharp, inquisitive mind. She had been raised in the intensely devout and austere court of her mother, Queen Isabella. It was a world of rigid piety, constant prayer, and strict moral codes. But beneath this veneer of pious obedience, there was a fire. Juana was known to have a melancholic and intensely passionate nature. Her emotions were not mild or moderate, they ran to frightening extremes. She loved with a consuming intensity and despaired with an equal, terrifying depth. Her tutors noted a streak of willfulness, a resistance to control that worried her deeply religious mother. She was a delicate instrument, strung far too tightly. In the cold calculus of statecraft, these were dangerous, inconvenient qualities. But they were ignored. She was a princess. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her duty was to her parents and her kingdom. In the summer of 1496, that duty called. A fleet of over 100 ships was assembled in the port of Lerdo. A magnificent armada designed to carry the 16-year-old princess to a new life, a new country, and a man she had never met. Her destination was Flanders, the heart of the glittering Burgundian court, and her groom was Philip, Duke of Burgundy, known throughout Europe by a single simple title, the Handsome. The journey itself was a terrifying omen. The fleet was battered by violent autumn storms in the Bay of Biscay. Ships were lost, sailors were drowned, and Juana's own vessel was so badly damaged. It was forced to seek refuge in England for weeks. She was violently ill, terrified, and isolated. It was a brutal introduction to the world outside the sheltered confines of the Spanish court. When she finally arrived in Flanders months later, she was a pale, nervous girl, stepping into a world that could not have been more alien to her. The Burgundian court was the jewel of northern Europe. Where the Spanish court was austere and pious, the Burgundian court was a kaleidoscope of color, opulence, and unapologetic decadence. It was a world of lavish feasts, elaborate tournaments, and a far more relaxed and open attitude towards courtly love and sexual dalliances. And at its center was Philip. He was 18 years old, and he was everything his moniker promised. Tall, athletic, with fair hair and charming blue eyes, he was the living embodiment of a chivalric hero. He was charismatic, confident, and worldly. He was the sun around which the entire Burgundian court orbited. When he and Juana finally met, the encounter was not the polite, formal ceremony that everyone expected. It was an explosion. Eyewitness accounts describe an immediate magnetic attraction. Philip was stunned by the Spanish infanta's dark, intense beauty, and Juana, who had spent her life in a world of stern old priests and formidable matrons, was utterly captivated by this vibrant, beautiful young man. The spark was so powerful, so undeniable, that it incinerated all royal protocol. They were supposed to wait for the formal wedding ceremony days away, but they couldn't. Philip leaned in and whispered to his new fiancée. Juana, her face flushed, nodded in agreement. They turned to the nearest court chaplain and demanded to be married right there on the spot, in a hastily arranged ceremony. They needed the sacrament performed immediately, for one reason only, so they could legally consummate their union without delay. That very night the shy, sheltered princess and the handsome, worldly duke fell into bed together, and for Juana it was not just the consummation of a marriage, it was the beginning of an all-consuming obsession. She had found the object for her fierce, unbridled passion. She had fallen desperately, irrevocably in love. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the political gamble had paid off in the most unexpected way. It was not just an alliance, it was a love match. Juana was blissfully happy. She wrote glowing letters back to her parents in Spain, filled with praise for her wonderful new husband. But the paradise was a fragile one, built on a foundation of incompatible personalities and clashing cultures. The very passion that had brought them together would soon become the source of unimaginable pain. Philip, while genuinely fond of his new wife, was a creature of his court. For him, fidelity was a quaint, foreign concept. He had been raised in a world where powerful men took mistresses as a matter of course. His initial infatuation with Juana soon settled into a comfortable affection, and he saw no reason why his marriage should interfere with his pleasures. He resumed his affairs discreetly at first, but with growing confidence. For Juana, this was not a minor indiscretion. It was a betrayal of a sacred vow. It was a dagger to the heart. Her intense, all-or-nothing nature could not comprehend or accept it, and her reaction was not the quiet, dignified suffering of a typical royal wife. It was explosive. Her love, so pure and total, curdled into a ferocious, public jealousy. She began to watch him, to track his movements, to suspect every woman at court. The golden, glittering cage of the Burgundian court became her personal torture chamber. There are accounts of her flying into rages, screaming at Philip in front of the entire court. She would lock herself in her rooms for days, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. Her behavior became erratic, unpredictable, and a source of constant scandal. In one infamous incident, she discovered that Philip was besotted with a lady in waiting. Juana, consumed by a white, hot fury, did not just dismiss the woman. She confronted her, seized a pair of scissors, and personally sheared off the beautiful blonde hair that her husband so admired. Then, according to some accounts, she scarred the woman's face. This was not the behavior of a stable, pious Spanish princess. The Burgundian courtiers began to whisper. They called her possessive, unhinged. They did not see a heartbroken woman reacting to infidelity. They saw the first signs of madness. Philip himself was bewildered, and then angered by her outbursts. He began to distance himself from her, finding her jealousy tiresome and her public scenes humiliating. The more he pulled away, the more desperately she clung to him, creating a vicious cycle of rejection and obsession. Even the birth of their children, Eleanor, Charles, and Isabella, did little to soothe her spirit. She loved her children, but her entire emotional universe revolved around one person, her unfaithful, beautiful husband. She was trapped, isolated in a foreign land, with a love that was slowly, inexorably driving her to the edge. While Juana's private world was fracturing, the political landscape of Europe was about to be shattered by a series of unforeseen tragedies, and with each death, the weight on Juana's fragile shoulders grew heavier. In 1497, just a year after her wedding, the first blow fell. Her brother, Juan, Prince of Asturias, the sole male heir to the Spanish thrones, died suddenly of a fever. The entire succession plan of Ferdinand and Isabella was thrown into chaos. The crown now passed to their eldest daughter, Isabella, Queen of Portugal. But less than a year later, Isabella herself died, while giving birth to a son, Miguel da Paz. For a brief time, it seemed this tiny infant would be the one to unite the entire Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. He was recognized as heir to all three kingdoms. But then, in 1500, before his second birthday, the child also died. In the space of 3 years, death had scythed through the Spanish line of succession, clearing a path directly to the one person who was never supposed to rule. Suddenly Juana, the third child, the spare part, the moody princess married off to a foreign duke, was the undisputed heir to the combined kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. She was no longer just the Duchess of Burgundy. She was the future ruler of a global empire, stretching from the castles of Spain to the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. This changed everything. For Philip, his wife's new status was a revelation. He was no longer just married to an infanta with a generous dowry. He was married to the key that could unlock the greatest prize in all of Christendom. His ambition, always a powerful force, was ignited. He was determined to be King of Castile, to rule this vast, wealthy kingdom. Juana was now the most important person in his life, not because he loved her more, but because she was the vessel of his ambitions. In 1502, he and a heavily pregnant Juana embarked on a long, arduous journey overland from Brussels to Toledo, to be formally recognized by the Castilian Cortes, the Parliament, as the rightful heirs. The trip was a disaster. The Spanish nobles and clergy were appalled by Philip's entourage of flamboyant, free, spending Flemish courtiers. They found Philip himself to be arrogant, dismissive of Spanish customs and greedy, and they were deeply disturbed by their new princess. Juana's emotional instability, exacerbated by the stresses of the journey and her pregnancy, was on full display. Her public arguments with Philip, her fits of melancholy, and her jealous guarding of her husband shocked a stern, formal Spanish court. Her own mother, Queen Isabella, watched with growing horror. She saw a daughter who was mentally and emotionally unequipped for the crushing burdens of queenship. The seeds of a terrible doubt were planted in the queen's mind. Was her daughter fit to rule? For Philip, the trip confirmed his worst fears about Spain. He found it austere, boring, and unwelcoming. As soon as the ceremonies were over, he was desperate to leave, and it was his next decision that would push Juana over the precipice, from jealous obsession into a true and terrifying darkness. In 1503, Philip announced his intention to return to Flanders. He claimed urgent business required his presence, but everyone knew the truth. He was bored of Spain and tired of his wife's suffocating jealousy. He planned to travel back alone, leaving Juana behind in Madrid. She was once again pregnant, and he used this as his excuse, claiming the journey would be too dangerous for her. Juana was inconsolable. The thought of being separated from him, of him returning to the decadent Burgundian court and its endless temptations, was more than she could bear. She begged, she pleaded, she raged. She threw herself at his feet, clinging to his legs, imploring him not to abandon her. He was unmoved. His ambition was now fused with a cold cruelty. He pried her hands from his boots, turned his back on his hysterical, pregnant wife, and rode away. Juana broke. The separation shattered what little composure she had left. She fell into a profound depression, a state of near catatonia punctuated by fits of frantic hysteria. She would spend her days and nights staring out of a single window in the castle of La Mater, the window that faced the road to Flanders, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, just watching, waiting for a husband who would not return. Her mother, Queen Isabella, was horrified. She tried to reason with her, to console her, but Juana was unreachable, locked in a prison of her own grief and obsession. Her behavior became so erratic that Isabella, fearing Juana would try to flee and follow Philip on foot, ordered the castle gates to be locked and barred. The heir to the throne was now a prisoner, held captive by her own mother. This torment continued for months. Then, in November of 1504, the final pillar of Juana's world collapsed. Her mother, the formidable Queen Isabella, died, and her last will and testament was a political bombshell that would set the stage for the final act of this tragedy. Isabella, deeply worried by her daughter's mental state, left the kingdom of Castile to Juana, as was her right. But she included a devastating clause. She decreed that if Juana proved unwilling to rule or unable to exercise her power, then her father, Ferdinand, would act as regent of Castile until Juana's own son, Charles, came of age. She pointedly, deliberately, cut Philip out. The will was a direct challenge to his ambitions. It created a power vacuum and pitted two ruthless men against each other, the aging but cunning Ferdinand and the young, ambitious Philip. And in the middle, the prize they were fighting over, was the broken mind of Queen Juana. When news of the will reached Philip in Flanders, he acted decisively. He was no longer going to wait. He was going to Spain to claim his wife's kingdom as his own. He forced a still grieving and deeply unstable Juana to join him, sailing for Spain in 1506. But this was not a rescue mission. It was a coup. On the journey, and upon their arrival, Philip and his allies began a systematic campaign to prove Juana's insanity. He isolated her from her Spanish advisors, surrounded her with his own people, and publicly presented her as incompetent. Every emotional outburst, every sign of grief, every jealous accusation was now twisted and presented as irrefutable proof of madness. He was no longer just her unfaithful husband, he was her jailer, actively working to usurp her birthright by declaring her mentally unfit to hold it. The political deal had come full circle. The man she was forced to marry was now the architect of her destruction, using the very love she felt for him as the primary weapon against her. They landed in Spain in the spring of 1506, and the political battle with Ferdinand began in earnest. Philip, with his handsome looks and promises of reform, quickly won the support of many Castilian nobles who were tired of the old king, Ferdinand. Outmaneuvered, Ferdinand reluctantly agreed to a treaty, the Concord of Villafranche, where he effectively surrendered control of Castile and promised to retreat to his own kingdom of Aragon. In a secret side agreement, Philip and Ferdinand declared Juana incapable of ruling due to her infirmities and passions, and agreed to exclude her from government completely. Philip had won. He was now, in all but name, King Philip I of Castile. He had achieved his ultimate ambition. He stood at the pinnacle of power, the ruler of a vast kingdom, with his mad wife safely under his control. His triumph would last for less than 3 months. In September 1506, in the city of Burgos, the 28-year-old Philip, in peak physical health, spent a hot afternoon playing a vigorous game of pelota, a form of tennis. Overheated and thirsty, he called for a glass of water. He drank it down icy cold. Within hours he was seized by a violent fever. He took to his bed, his body racked with pain and chills. The doctors were powerless. His condition worsened with terrifying speed. Some whispered of poison, a final, vengeful act by the defeated Ferdinand. Others would later blame a virulent strain of typhoid fever. Whatever the cause, within a week, Philip the Handsome, the Golden Prince of Burgundy, the new de facto King of Castile, was dead. And for Juana, the moment of his death was not an ending, but a horrifying new beginning. The news was broken to her gently. Her reaction was unnervingly calm. There were no screams, no tears, no hysterics. She simply walked to his deathbed, touched his face and said, "My husband." It was the calm before a psychological storm of unprecedented proportions. This is where her final, complete break from reality occurred. The grief, the betrayals, the pressure, the love, and the hate all coalesced into a singular bizarre obsession. She would not let him go. She refused to allow his body to be buried. She sat by his bedside day and night, guarding the corpse as if she could protect it from the finality of death itself. When her father Ferdinand sought to have the body interred in Burgos, she flew into a rage, accusing him of trying to steal her husband. Her husband's body was now the only thing in the world she had left, the physical anchor for her shattered mind. The body began to decay. The court physicians, alarmed, insisted on embalming. Juana watched the entire gruesome process, the removal of the organs, the filling of the cavities with spices and herbs, without shedding a tear. Her focus was absolute. Now we return to that horrifying procession. After weeks of this macabre vigil in Burgos, Juana finally consented to move the body, but only on her own, strange terms. She declared that Philip had once told her he wished to be buried in the royal chapel of Granada, alongside her own parents. This meant a journey of hundreds of miles across the heart of Spain. And she laid down two chilling rules. First, the procession would only travel at night. When asked why, she gave a truly haunting answer. A widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not be seen in the light of day. Second, and most revealingly, she decreed that no woman, not even a nun, was permitted to come near the coffin or the entourage. Her jealousy, which had tormented her in his life, now extended beyond the grave. She was still protecting him from the temptations of other women, even in death. So began the journey. For 8 agonizing months, from the autumn of 1506 through the brutal Castilian winter, the phantom procession moved slowly south. Juana, the coffin queen, led the way. At each stop, the same ghastly ritual unfolded. She would command the coffin to be opened, so she could look upon his face, touch his embalmed hands, and kiss his feet. Her sanity had not just cracked, it had been ground to dust, and its remnants were scattered along that terrible night road. This was the ultimate, tragic expression of her love. Unable to possess him in life, she possessed him completely in death. The political deal had given her a husband, and in the end, all she had left of that deal was his corpse. Finally, in the summer of 1507, the macabre journey came to an end. Her father, Ferdinand, his political position now secure, intercepted the procession. He had all the proof he needed. His daughter's public, bizarre behavior was undeniable evidence of her madness. It was the perfect justification for him to seize the regency that Queen Isabella's will had granted him. He met his daughter not with compassion, but with cold political purpose. He gently but firmly took control, ending her grim pilgrimage. But he did not offer her healing, or comfort, or freedom. He took her to the town of Tordesillas, a small dreary town on the banks of the Douro River, and there he confined her within the walls of the royal convent of Santa Clara. It was not a retreat. It was a prison. Juana, the rightful queen of Castile and Aragon, was locked away from the world. Her last child, Catherine, born after Philip's death, was initially allowed to stay with her, a small comfort in her desolate life. But as the years passed, even Catherine was taken from her. She was stripped of her power, her children, her titles, and her freedom. She was a queen only in name, a ghost haunting a fortress, while her father ruled her kingdom. When Ferdinand died in 1516, there was a glimmer of hope. Power now passed to Joanna's own son, Charles, the boy who had been raised in Flanders and was now a young man. He came to Spain to claim his inheritance. He visited his mother in Tordesillas. He saw the woman who had been imprisoned for nearly a decade, and he made a decision. For Charles to rule Castile without challenge, his mother, the true queen, had to remain officially incapable. The son continued the father's cruelty. He not only upheld her imprisonment, but in some ways made it harsher, tightening the restrictions and ensuring she remained completely isolated from the outside world. The ultimate betrayal. The son she had borne chose power over his own mother. For 46 years, Juana remained a prisoner in Tordesillas. 46 years. She aged from a grief-stricken young widow of 28 into an old woman of 75. She lived through the entirety of her son's glorious reign as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in European history. He ruled her kingdoms, spent her wealth, and commanded her armies, all while she languished in a single fortified building, her existence a mere footnote to his own grand story. She finally died in 1555, in the same fortress where she had been confined for nearly half a century. She was buried, at last, in the royal chapel of Granada, laid to rest beside the husband, whose death had consumed her, and next to the parents whose ambition had set her tragic fate in motion. So we are left with the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Was Juana truly La Loca, the Mad? Or was she something far more tragic? Was she an intelligent, passionate woman, whose deep capacity for love was seen as a weakness? Was she a victim, systematically broken by the relentless pressures of a political system that saw her only as a pawn? Was her madness a clinical condition? Or was it a sane response to an insane world of betrayal? The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in the murky space between. She may well have had a predisposition to mental instability, a brittleness in her soul, as her mother feared. But this fragility was relentlessly exploited. It was exploited by a philandering husband who ignited her love, and then mocked her jealousy. It was exploited by an ambitious father who used her grief as a ladder to power, and it was exploited by a ruthless son who kept her imprisoned to secure his own throne. They all had a vested interest in her being mad. The diagnosis served their politics. The horror of her arranged marriage was not simply that it was loveless. For a time it was anything but. The true horror was that it gave her something to love with all the fierce, desperate power of her soul, and then it turned that very love into the instrument of her torture and her condemnation. The political deal was a success. It created the Habsburg Empire in Spain and launched a golden age. But it demanded a human sacrifice. It took a young girl, a princess named Juana, and offered her mind, her freedom, and her life on the cold altar of statecraft. History remembers her as Juana the Mad, but perhaps a more fitting title would be Juana the Betrayed, the queen who was destroyed not by her madness, but by the calculated sanity of the men who loved power more than they ever loved her.